Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and honored guests. I'm Cynthia Sabo, President of Executive Women at State, and on behalf of EWAS and the Office of Civil Rights, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Department's 2013 Women's History Month commemoration. I would like to welcome in particular our distinguished speaker, Dr. Eisler, representatives of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development with whom she's been meeting during her time in Washington, and Kim Otis, Director of the Caring Economy Project and members of her advisory board. Kim has been a close partner with us in the preparations for today's program, and we are very grateful to her and Dr. Eisler for being here today. I would also like to welcome students from the School Without Walls who are joining us. And finally, I'd like to ask the members of the Office of Civil Rights and the three boards of Executive Women at State, without whom today's program could not have been accomplished, if they would just stand for a minute or wave your hands and let everybody see where you are. Women's History Month was established by Congress in 1987 to honor the extraordinary achievements of American women and ensure that the history of American women would be recognized and celebrated in schools, workplaces, and communities throughout the country. This commemoration has grown from a small celebration in Sonoma, California in 1978 to the first presidential proclamation on Women's History Week in 1980 to the formal congressional designation of Women's History Month in 1987. Our goal, needless to say, is to have the history, accomplishments, and leadership of women recognized throughout the year. I invite you to read the President's proclamation in your program for some of the history of this event and the women who helped to inspire it. This is the 5th year that Executive Women at State has co-sponsored the Women's History Month program with the Office of Civil Rights. It's hard for me to believe that it's been more than 6 years since a dozen determined senior women, some of whom are in this room today, came together for the purpose of promoting, supporting, and mentoring career women for senior leadership positions in the department. During those 6 years, we've added the mid-level associates and the entry and junior level program, as well as Friends of Executive Women at State for those who wish to support our mission without becoming full members. And we now boast nearly 1,500 members located within the department and across the globe. We've also assisted with the establishment of a sister organization, Women at Aid, which represents another 400 foreign affairs women at USAID. We couldn't do what we've done without the support of the department, the Office of Civil Rights, and in particular, our outstanding leadership liaison, Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs, Janice Jacobs. Janice is the epitome of what we, the women of Executive Women at State, strive to be. A senior career woman who works to balance personal life with a distinguished leadership career as Deputy Chief of Mission, Deputy Assistant Secretary, Ambassador, and now Assistant Secretary. All the while supporting and mentoring other women, indeed all employees, to grow, develop, and become effective leaders themselves. She's an inspiration to us all. Please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Janice Jacobs to the stage to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. We are honored to have with us today our distinguished speaker for Women's History Month, Dr. Riane Eisler. Dr. Eisler is an attorney, social and cultural historian, advocate for women and children, well-respected educator, and an inspiring leader. As a child refugee of the Nazis, she has made it her lifelong goal to find alternatives to harmful domination models in favor of partnership. Dr. Eisler's influential work over several decades includes authoring and contributing to many books and hundreds of articles. The Chalice and the Blade, a bestseller translated into 25 foreign editions, is an eye-opening, sweeping overview of the potential for cultural transformation with greater gender balance. Her most recent book, The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, has been hailed by Gloria Steinem as revolutionary and by Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a template for the better world we have been so urgently seeking. We are indeed grateful to Dr. Eisler for her tireless efforts to show us a better way forward. As president of the Center for Partnership Studies, her mission is to demonstrate how partnership models support a more equitable, caring, and sustaining way of life for our societies and our planet. She's a co-founder of the Caring Economy Campaign with Kimberly Otis, as well as the co-founder of the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence with Nobel laureate Becky Williams. Dr. Eisler is a member of the Club of Rome, serves on many boards and councils, including the World Future Council and the Global Council of the International Museum of Women. She is a fellow of the World Academy of Art and Science. She has taught at UCLA and other universities. She speaks at international conferences worldwide, including at the United Nations General Assembly, major corporations, and events hosted by heads of state. She's been awarded many honors, as you can see in your programs. We are delighted to host Dr. Eisler at the Department of State following former Secretary Clinton's vibrant legacy of recognizing women's roles in development, diplomacy, peacekeeping, and economic prosperity. Former Secretary Clinton emphasized the importance of women's contributions through several channels and initiatives, including the first QDDR, the Evidence and Data for Gender Equality Initiative, or EDGE, and the Data 2X initiative, among others. Secretary Clinton also launched the Women in Public Service Project, whose goal is to have 50% female political and civic leadership worldwide by the year 2050. All of these efforts confirm that partnership models and valuation of women are essential to developing human capital and capacities, which are the most important factors in successful societies and economies, as we will soon hear from Dr. Eisler. With these and many other voices, the scales are tipping slowly towards greater gender balance around the globe. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Eisler.
Thank you so much. Well, it's wonderful to be here with you. I'm trying not to trip on all these chords. It would be sort of a spectacular beginning, right? And I assume that you can hear me, that I'm not just talking to myself. Well, I want to, first of all, thank all of you for being here. I want to thank the Executive Women of State and the Office of Civil Rights for inviting me. And I want to give special thanks to Ruth Hall and to Rebecca Webb and to Cynthia Sabo and all the others who have given so much care to making this event possible. And of course, I again want to thank Secretary Jacobs for her introduction, her warm introduction to me. And you know, I want to tell you that it is for me a particular pleasure to be at this event because when I first became involved in the women's movement a little over a generation ago, it would have been impossible. I mean, first of all, executive women at the State Department, where were they? And we didn't even have Women's History Month. Although I have to say, I absolutely agree with Cynthia. It's a little strange, isn't it, to have 1 month for half of the nation? And we really need to have our history integrated into everything. In fact, I wrote a book about that, and other things called Tomorrow's Children, Education for the 21st Century, which is about a gender-balanced, diverse, etc. education. Well, the point of it is that, yes, we obviously have made some progress, but we obviously still have a very, very long way to go, which is all too evident, isn't it, if you consider the horrific violence against women that in many places is today still not prosecuted. If you consider that in many world regions, women and girls are still denied the basics, education, health care, access to property. In fact, in some regions, they can't even leave their homes, by themselves. They're under house arrest, right? That's what it really is. So, and even here, we are barely hanging on to hard-fought gains, reproductive rights, contraception. This is bizarre, but there it is. It's under attack. And yes, we are still a small minority in government and in business and other positions of leadership. And yet, these matters that so powerfully really impact women's lives and all too often deaths are still generally talked about as, quote, just women's issues, which is patently absurd, isn't it? We are half of humanity, actually the majority. And yet, that's how most policymakers think. And that's just how marginalized we still are. For example, there is a great deal of talk, as you know too well, in the United Nations about poverty. But how often do we really hear how disproportionate women's poverty is worldwide? Not only in the developing world, but right here, that according to the US Census Bureau statistics, in this wealthy nation, women over the age of 65 are almost twice as likely to live in poverty as men of the same age. And that's not only because of the persistence, of course, of gender-based discrimination. It's because most of these women are or were either full or part-time caregivers. And poverty is their reward for this essential work. So it's up to us, to you, to change the political and economic discourse and policies so that these so-called women's issues are no longer marginalized. And I'm going to propose to you that this is not only essential for the sake of women and girls, but for everyone. Because, and this is one of the central findings from my research, and increasingly also from the research of others, as the signal of my talk, as the title of my talk signals, what's good for women is good for the world, and conversely, what's bad for women is bad for the world. And right away, I can give you some empirical evidence. We at the Center for Partnership Studies did a statistical, because people always want it quantified, right? We did a statistical study using data from 89 nations, looking at two bundles of data. One bundle were measures of quality of life, all the way from infant mortality, access to potable water, human rights and environmental ratings. The other bundle were measures of the status of women. And we found that in significant respects, the status of women can actually be a better predictor of general quality of life than GDP. Now that was and you can download that, by the way, from one of our websites, either partnershipway.org or caringeconomy.org. But that was a pioneering study, which we actually did in time for the 1995 Women's Conference in Beijing. But since then, these findings have been verified by other studies, including the World Economic Forum's annual global gender gap reports. And these reports, if you really look at them carefully, they show that the nations with the lowest gender gaps, and unfortunately, as yet, we still have no nation that doesn't have any gender gap. But the nations with the lowest gender gaps are always in the highest tiers of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports. So not only does the status of women correlate strongly with general quality of life, but also with national economic success. And I will get back to that, especially in the second part of my talk, which, as the subtitle signals, is Foundations for a Caring Economy, because I'm trying to give you a lot of information in a short time. But first, I thought I should tell you a little about myself and my research, because there was a time when I had absolutely no inkling whatsoever of the systemic connections between the status of women and a society's values and institutions. In fact, it was not until the late 1960s that I woke up as if from a long drugged sleep, along with thousands of other women, to realize, gosh, a lot of these problems I thought were me, personal. Well, I shared them with all of these other women. They were obviously social problems. So I threw myself into the women's liberation movement. And because my training is not only as a social and systems scientist, but also as an attorney, I founded the first center in the United States on women and the law. And at that time, people would look at me blankly and say, women and the law? What does that mean? I mean, it wasn't even part of our consciousness. Can you imagine? Well, what it meant is that as late as 1969, I had to write a friend of the court brief to the United States Supreme Court, making the then radical argument that women should be considered persons under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Well, eventually we were able to use that clause to strike down blatantly discriminatory laws and practices. For example, and most of you are too young to remember this, the want ads. They were segregated into help wanted female and help wanted male, and you guessed it, all the dead-end jobs were under help wanted female. But after a while, and this became very evident with the Equal Rights Amendment, and by the way, I wrote the first and only mass paperback on the Equal Rights Amendment. It's called the Equal Rights Handbook. When that amendment was defeated, that simple amendment, it just said that neither the federal government nor any state government may discriminate on the basis of sex. I mean, it's kind of milquetoast, isn't it? But it got defeated. And so it became evident that the problem was much deeper, that it was really a cultural problem. So that was one of the impetus. There were others, like having been a Holocaust survivor and wanting to know whether all this misery and violence and so on is really necessary. I decided that I would make a career change and go back to my training as a social and systems scientist. And I embarked then on the multidisciplinary cross-cultural historical study for which I am known. And one of the main findings from this study is directly related, well, to the title of this talk, What's Good for Women is Good for the World, which is that we really have to think in systemic terms. And that as long as women are devalued, so also will traits and activities stereotypically associated with women and the so-called soft and feminine, such as caring, caregiving, nonviolence, be devalued. In other words, the finding from this work, and it's really about connecting the dots, it's about seeing how the status of women is inextricably interconnected with a society's system of values, as well as with the construction of every single institution, from the family, whether it's authoritarian or more democratic, to religion, to education, politics, and as you will see later, economics. And I'm going to briefly illustrate, because I told you I'm going to give you a lot of information in a short time. If you look at some of the most regressive, repressive, violent regimes of modern times, what you see is that for them, whether it was for Hitler's Germany, for Stalin's Soviet Union, Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban of Afghanistan, or other so-called religious, and I say so-called religious, fundamentalists, for them, a top priority was and is pushing women back into their, quote, traditional place. Of course, we know that's a code word, isn't it, for subservient. In a, quote, traditional family, that's another code phrase, isn't it, for for an authoritarian, male-headed, very punitive family, where children are taught a basic lesson. They are taught to equate difference, beginning with the fundamental difference between male and female, in our species, that's fundamental, with either superiority or inferiority, with either dominating or being dominated, with either being served or serving. And of course, that reinforces and teaches something, doesn't it? That you can apply that then to any other outgroup, to any other difference, whether it's based on race, whether it's based on religion, whether it is based on sexual orientation, you name it. And this is why we see this strong correlation between rigid male dominance and prejudice against outgroups. But you only see this once you start taking into account how a society structures gender relations, which most important studies, right, of societies completely ignore. And here I want to put something on the table, which is that, well, we know that many people are uncomfortable talking about gender, aren't they? So we have to acknowledge that. But we also have to note something else, what the great sociologist Louis Wirth said, which is that the most important things about a society are those that people are uncomfortable talking about. And we saw that with race, didn't we? And it was only as we started to talk about it that things began to improve. And the same thing is true about gender. So we have got to talk much more about it. Because consider how ironic it is that those who are trying to push us back, they recognize in their gut the connection between the status of women and the kind of repressive, violent society they seek to impose. And yet, for many people who consider themselves progressive, these are, quote, just women's issues. Have you noticed? Well, we've got to change it, and it's up to us, to all of us, to change that. So how do we do this? Well, unfortunately, as you well know, even though it has helped us make some progress, it simply has not been enough to say that the global pandemic of discrimination and violence against women is unjust, that it violates the most basic human rights. In other words, the social justice and human rights argument, as essential as it is, has not been enough. So we need an additional strategy. And that's been at the core of my work. That's why I belong to all of these councils, which are mostly of men, where I sort of start saying, women, gender, hello. All right, but this strategy is very simple. It is to show that not only does the devaluation of women and the stereotypically feminine, because we're not talking about anything inherent in women and men at all, that not only does it have terrible effects on women and girls, but that it has terrible effects on us all. And that takes me directly, as I promised, to the second part of my talk, focusing we really, many of us realize, as Einstein said, you can't solve problems with the same thinking that created them. So we really have to get past that tired, stale old argument of capitalism versus socialism. Manifestly, neither is capable of meeting our unprecedented environmental, economic, and social challenges. Now, that doesn't mean we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need markets. Unfortunately, we don't happen to have free markets with all of these huge entities, these multinationals, and we certainly need government policies planning. You know that very well. So we want to retain the best elements of both, but we have to really move beyond them to a new economics, which is the theme, as you heard, of my most recent book, The Real Wealth of Nations. And that book starts with a premise that, once articulated, may sound perfectly obvious. This is that the real wealth of a nation, of the world, is not just financial, and we certainly saw that, didn't we, with the complete disappearance into thin air of all of those derivatives, all of those credit swaps. We see it every day with how the stock market seesaws up and down, right? That the real wealth of a nation, the real wealth of the world, consists of the contributions of people and of nature. So we need what we have not had: economic measurements, policies, and practices that give visibility and real value to what is really, if you think about it, actually the most important human work. The work of caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for our natural environment. And before I go any further, I would like to play for you a 3-minute video from our website on the Caring Economy campaign, showing the urgent need for new measures of economic success, social wealth indicators that show the enormous economic value of this so-called women's work of caring, caregiving as foundational, not only to ending women's disproportionate poverty, not only to finally being able to do this balancing act, right, of so-called work and life. Of course, we work in our homes, obviously, so I'm always bothered when people say, do you work? Yeah. But it's also foundational, as you will see, to moving to a more equitable and sustainable and prosperous future for us all. So could we have the little video?
You don't often see the words caring and economy next to each other. But what if you did? What would begin to change? When we measure the health of our economy using GDP or the stock market, we miss important things with real economic value. Caring for a child, a clean environment, volunteering. What if these essential but undervalued activities were included in how we measure economic success? Would we have the crisis we are in today? Would we have so much suffering, greed, pollution, and so much lost human potential? It does not have to be this way. U.S. maternal mortality rates, highest of all developed nations. U.S. children in poverty, more than 1 in 5 U.S. children. 4 times higher than Denmark, Finland, and Norway. We can change our course and move to a caring, equitable, and sustainable future. The Caring Economy campaign has 2 goals. First, change the conversation with accurate measures of economic health that show the enormous contribution of caring to human well-being and economic success. Second, And here's where you come in. Empower organizations and individuals to lead the movement for a caring economy. Locally, nationally, internationally, we can make it happen. Tax credits for childcare, higher pay for elder care workers, paid family leave, tax breaks for caring businesses, and support for early childhood education. A rise in real wealth for all, not just a few. If you believe caring and the economy belong together, join the Caring Economy Campaign Coalition and encourage your organization to do so too. Here's a message from Riane Eisler, President of the Center for Partnership Studies and author of The Real Wealth of Nations.
Policymakers need this information, and it's up to us to get it to them. Let's do it. Let's do it for ourselves, for our children, and for generations to come.
Join the campaign coalition.
Well, you have now seen a video that puts caring and economy together, right? And I want to say to you that isn't it, I'm going to wait for a moment, isn't it interesting how many of us do a double take, don't we? Just seeing caring and economy linked together. But think about it, isn't that a terrible comment on the uncaring values that we have learned to accept as driving economic systems? Now, this devaluation is deeply rooted in a system of gendered values. Think about it for a moment, where, as I said, caring, caregiving, the so-called soft, the stereotypically feminine is devalued. It's even devalued in men. Think of how men who are caring, sensitive, have traditionally, I mean, for a long time, it's beginning to change, thank goodness, been called sissies, weak sisters, held in contempt not only by other men, but by many women. And of course, we see this devaluation starkly in business and in government policies. I mean, consider for a moment how many people, including politicians, they don't seem to have any trouble finding funding, finding money for these stereotypically masculine activities. And again, I have to emphasize, nothing to do with anything inherent in women and men. We're talking about old stereotypes. There's always money, for example, for prisons. Well, think of the old stereotype of the punitive head of, the father, the punitive head of family, right? They always seem to have money for weapons, for wars, unnecessary ones. I mean, of course we need defense, but I mean, for them, anything to do with that, well, think about the stereotype of the hero as warrior. It's an old masculine stereotype, but somehow, when it comes to finding money for the soft, right, for caring, for nutrition for children, for care for children, health care, for early childhood education. Hey, we don't have money. Well, this, of course, is inhuman. And this is very important, and this is really where we have to think about things in a way that can help us change the conversation. It is also economically irrational. Indeed, it is economically suicidal. We are now we're well into the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial knowledge service economy, a time when economists never tire of telling us that the most important capital is what they like to call high-quality human capital. Well, we know, not only from psychology, but from neuroscience, that whether or not we can have these flexible, innovative, creative people who can work in teams rather than just taking orders from above, who can solve problems, that heavily hinges on the quality of care and education children receive early on when their very brains are still forming. So think of how irrational this flap is right now about allocating here in the United States a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of money for early childhood education. I mean, it makes no sense, does it, from a purely rational standpoint, but it's so deeply ingrained, isn't it, this system of gendered values, that anything to do with caring for children, it's secondary. Well, the point of it is this: we have to seize the opportunity now to use a purely economic benefit argument to expose this gendered system of values that has held us back. And our first step, as I said, is changing the economic conversation. And the best way to do this is by showing that caring policies and practices pay, not only in human and environmental terms, but in purely economic terms. And I again want to give you two quick examples. One is from business. Studies show, for example, and the Real Wealth of Nations has a lot of these studies, shows that the companies that regularly appear as the best companies to work for in the Fortune 500 or the Working Women lists, they have a substantially higher return to their investors. It makes sense, doesn't it? People feel they and their families are cared for. They're going to work very hard to make that company successful. The second example of this connecting of dots is from nations. The examples that I want to give you are of nations that at the beginning of the 20th century were so poor there were famines. Whole states, nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, whole states, whole American states, Minnesota, were populated by people fleeing from them, right? Today, these nations are invariably in the highest tiers, not only of the United Nations Human Development Reports, but of the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Reports. And a major factor is that they instituted more caring policies, universal health care, stipends to help families care for children, elder care with dignity, high-quality early childhood education, generous paid parental leave for both women and men, mothers and fathers in families where there are both. But in short, they gave visibility and value, didn't they, to the work of caring and caregiving. And I want to add that they are not socialists. They have very healthy market economies, thank you. What they always call themselves, it's interesting, is caring societies. And that's what we have to aim for, isn't it? But I want to take this connecting of dots just for a moment a little further and deeper, because these caring policies did not spring up in a vacuum. They were part of a cultural shift from a domination system in which, as you glimpsed, this ranking of male over female is core, is central, to a partnership system in which there is more equal partnership in both the family and the state between women and men. And yes, in these nations, women are approximately 40% of the national legislature. But it is not only that women as a bloc, we know, I say as a bloc because some individual women do not vote for caring policies, right? But women as a bloc do tend to do that, but that's not the whole story. It is one of systems dynamics. As the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their status, to their, quote, masculinity, to also embrace more stereotypically feminine traits, activities. We see it with all the guys who are today diapering babies, right? I mean, who would have done this? It would only happen as the status of women rose. And that's exactly what you see in the Scandinavian Nordic nations. They're not ideal societies. You know, we always want to have it be perfect. If there's an alternative, they're not perfect. But they have low poverty rates, low crime rates, a generally high quality of life for all. And yes, they have more gender balance. And they also have something else, which is part of the partnership configuration, which is they are in the forefront of trying to leave behind traditions of violence and domination. The first peace studies came out of those nations. The first law saying it's against the law to use physical discipline on children. A strong men's movement to disentangle quote, masculinity from its association with domination and violence. So we really, as I said, have to think in systemic terms. We have to help the public policymakers to think in systemic terms and reframe the political and economic discourse in ways that take, quote, gender issues into full account. And a very, very important part of this is what we're working on, and I invite you to work with us on. It is to change how economic health is measured. And that's why our Caring Economy campaign really focuses so much on what we call social wealth economic indicators, more accurate, more inclusive measures of economic health, which are essential as the basis for a more sound and caring economy, for better policies. Those are the kinds of measures policymakers need, don't they? To make sound decisions, not GDP, which actually includes activities that take life, like making cigarettes, the medical bills, the funeral bills, they're great for GDP, right? I mean, they need something sensible. And that's what these social wealth measures are. And they take into account, yes, the enormous economic contributions of the so-called women's work of caring and caregiving in both the market and non-market sectors. Now, some people would say to you, wait a minute, how can you measure the value of care work in households, right? Well, not only can you, but it's being done. We have satellite reports. They're not yet part of the main event, but they're there. And they tell us that the value of this work, which is mostly the caring work, is between 30 to 50% of the reported GDP. The 30% is from a US report, the 40% from a Swiss, which are not the most radical nation in the world, and the 50% is from a recent Australian report. But you would never know this, would you, in the conventional discourse? And that's why we held a Capitol Hill briefing yesterday on the economic value of care work and early childhood education, because it's really our job to change the discourse. And it featured our new report, which we did with the Urban Institute, called National Indicators in Social Wealth, which you can download at caringeconomy.org. So, my friends, this is our challenge. Our challenge is not only to continue our work for women's rights and women's empowerment, and yes, for the entry of more women into leadership positions, all these areas from which we've been barred. Our job is to do something else now from which we have far too long been barred. It is to work together with enlightened men to re-examine and reconstruct the economic structures and rules. Rules and structures that were developed without taking into account the needs, the problems, the contributions, the aspirations of the female half of humanity, and all too often without taking into account the humanity of either women or men. And we can do it because economic systems are human creations. So let's take advantage of the dislocations of this shift from the industrial to the post-industrial era. Economic systems will change, but the direction, whether it will be in a more caring and effective direction, that's up to us. So let's move these, quote, women's issues that are so vital for women and girls and for us all, from the margins to the center of the political and economic agenda, and then we will have the foundations for that more equitable, sustainable, caring future we so want and need. I thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to stay up here?
Yes.
Okay, because
Yes.
I would like to have a conversation if we have time.
And we would like to have a conversation as well. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. And thank you, Dr. Eisler, for sharing your thoughts with us. I think we all have a lot to chew on in terms of transforming our GDP to perhaps a CDP. Carrying domestic product.
I
No.
love that. I think that's great.
Okay, well, there we go. It is an honor to have you here today. And so now let's move to the conversation portion of the event. Again, we very much appreciate the opportunity for this interactive dialogue with you. For those who have questions, we just ask that you use the microphones that are located in the aisles next to, or on either side of the auditorium. So with that, let's take the first question. And we'll start here with Doris.
Good afternoon, Dr. Eisler. Thank you very much for being here.
Where are you? Oh, there you are. Thank
Hi.
you. Yes, hi.
Hello. As you've so eloquently stated, just like with slavery, it's clear that the dominated model is not working. Why then is it so difficult for people, in the face of all the evidence that it's detrimental not only to those being dominated but to the dominators, is it so difficult for people to give up those models and to move to such things as a caring economy? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to tell you that this is very deeply ingrained, and in the dominator psyche, that comes out of very punitive, top-down families to a very large extent, and communities as well, there are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. So it's very hard for them to really even understand that there is another alternative. But I want to say something to you. Sometimes I say it as something of a joke, that when I get depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages. Why? Because if you really think about it, that was a rigid domination system. In fact, it looked a lot like the Taliban, didn't it? The Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, women had no rights, children had no rights. I mean, it was miserable. And we moved, didn't we? But we moved, among other things, by changing the normative ideals, by changing the conversation. In the Middle Ages, the normative ideals were fealty, obedience, right? And what St. Augustine said, that for somebody to question their situation in the hierarchy, it was like an eye wanting to be a mouse, or vice versa. I mean, it was just out of the realm of possibility. Well, we started to talk about ideas like freedom, like equality, right? And we started to move, but it wasn't a linear upward movement. It's been a spiral upward movement with dips, and we sure are in a dip. But that's precisely the time to take advantage of, as I said, of all the dislocation, the fact that things aren't working, to go to people to where they're at, start with where they're at, and show them that there is a better alternative, not just that things aren't working, but that if you start paying attention to these things, it can work. Some people will be hermetically sealed, and there's no point in wasting your time. But you will find that there are some, as I have found, for whom gender was never even on their radar, who suddenly say, oh, and get it, that you have to make the connections between all of these ugly isms, racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, they're all part of the same domination package, aren't they? So it's up to you to do that. You, I mean, just you and a few others, all right? Thank you. And I'll try to make my answer briefer, but that was quite a question.
Dr. Eisler, we're so thrilled that you're here, and I really believe your message needs to be heard across the globe by so many cultures. I'm going to take advantage here and ask you two questions. One is, how can we support the Caring Economy campaign, especially the proper valuation of caregiving? As you say, it needs to be economically valued. And secondly, this is more of a question that you had mentioned in your book that sort of had me thinking, that you originally had felt overwhelmed by the extent of the problem of the domination systems, but that you found a way to make a difference and encourage partnership models. And I think a lot of us do feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem. So could you tell us more about this transformation that you had, this personal transformation, and what lessons there might be for the rest of us? Thank you.
Ruth, the short answer to the second part of your question is I became engaged. I just started to work for change, but, and this is really important, I mean, sure, I was first in the civil rights movement and then in the women's movement, but then I understood something, that we can't just protest, okay? I mean, we can, but it doesn't really change the system. It just reinforces, this feeling of hopelessness, actually. That you wouldn't build a house, would you, without a plan? Well, the partnership model, as I've really pointed it out, the configuration of the partnership model as contrasted to the domination model is that plan. And the foundations, you also wouldn't build a house without first building foundations. Think about what we know from psychology, from neuroscience, that these gender relations, these parent-child relations, that's where people first get, don't they, their mental maps and emotional maps for all relations. So we've got to pay much, much more attention to these primary human relations and to changing them from domination to partnership worldwide. I just wrote a paper for a Cambridge University Press book on crimes against the majority, proposing, the majority are women and children, right? Proposing that the crimes section of the Crimes Against Humanity section of the Rome Statute of International Law be invoked, not only again for the sake of women, because of, I keep saying that, yes, it's wrong, it's this, it's that, but for the sake of us all, because of the systemic damage that, for example, child brides, genital mutilation, all these horrible things do to society and economy at large. Got to do that. So we have our work cut out for us, but that is what really keeps my spirits up, is not only being one person, but knowing that there are many others that are working in this. So I invite you to get your spirits up. Thank you.
Hello, Doctor. I really enjoyed the presentation today. My question is, today in our society, we have women, educated women in power who speak out, criticize, and even vote down legislation that benefits women, families, and children. So what do we say to them? How do we address them? And obviously, if we all worked, or if we were all united, we would make more progress than divided. So what do we do?
Well, these women who vote against women, who vote against the quote soft, right? The stereotypically feminine, they do it because that's how they can sort of make their way up domination hierarchies. They get kudos, so you've got to change the value system. Because as long as, sort of like Sarah Palin, right? I don't believe in any of this caring stuff and da-da-da. Well, that's how she got where she got, right? So I don't know that there's much you can say to those women, okay? But what you can say, what I'd like to say to them,
As I said, we have to work as women leaders with enlightened men to really change things. And I have found that it is much better to spend your energy where there's an opening rather than where it probably isn't. Some of these women might change, you never know, but I don't think that's your best target. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday that basically said that a lot of the problems with younger males and their economic status has to do with the fact that many of them were raised in single-parent households, specifically by women. And so I just like your take on, I guess, the new science, well, and perhaps the old science of whatever is at fault with human beings is because of the care they did or did not receive from their mother without taking into account the other factors.
Let's blame
Thanks.
mom. I mean, Freud, and all of the psychology thing. I mean, this is not a new thing. But of course, it's absolute nonsense. Look, let's take Sweden. They have a very low poverty rate, and they have a very high single mother-headed family rate and a very low single mother poverty rate, number one, okay? It's a question of policy that we're talking about here. But, I mean, it's part of this backlash, isn't it? I mean, because what they're really doing is blaming women. I mean, they happen to be focusing on the single mother, but somehow it's the same old game. Women, you've heard of Eve. What more can I say? And I'm so glad you asked that, because I'll tell you something. I have been in meetings where somebody has said something really outrageous, and nobody said anything except me. And then afterwards, all these women would come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up." Well, what I'm saying is we all have to speak up. I mean, it takes courage, my friends, but it took courage to make the changes from the Middle Ages to today. So let's do it. That's the only thing I can say to you. And I know that you are in a position here at the State Department, as executive women in the State Department, to really make a big difference. And that's why I was so delighted when you invited me, and I thank you.
And I think we have time for one more question. And we'll start over here. Yeah. Well, let's go to the side of the room. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's good.
Maybe two. If we have time for two, can we?
Well, I'll make this short then, and I'm not even sure exactly what my question part of this is, but when you talk about the monetization, almost sort of looking at the value, let's talk about, the thing that came to my mind with women and girls today is there is a part of it that is monetized, and that is the horrible practice of sex trafficking, both here in the United States and overseas. And I think this sort of captures a lot of what you're talking about, this idea that it's certainly domination. And it shows me how far away we are from what you were talking about as where we want to go. And I would like just to have your thoughts on that particular practice and what we can do to try to start breaking the mindset that goes into that not being forcefully attacked in the way that we would like for it to be.
Well, I think that is a very interesting question. You've brought up two issues. One, it's the devaluation of women. I mean, some of these women are actually sold by their families.
Yes.
And they themselves accept it as their duty somehow to contribute to their families so that their brothers can go to school. Well, I mean, we're talking about what I've been talking about, the devaluation of half of humanity. If you don't change that, you're not going to change sex trafficking. I mean, the fact that we're talking about sex trafficking and that there are beginning to be more teeth, if you will, to the measures against it is a sign that we're moving forward. Monetization, I want to bring that up. We're not going to get rid of money. Happens to be a very good invention. It's better than trading cows or sheep or, I mean, who knows the equal value of your pot of grain and my pot of, I mean, you know. So that's not the problem. The problem is we have a monetized society, and if we don't have paid parental leave, if we don't have stipends, we should have caregiver tax credits, for example. Why? We have child credits, but the caregiver is invisible, and they should be, as actually Congressman Moran said at our meeting yesterday at our briefing, they should be such that if you're under the poverty line, you get a refund, refundable, basically. I mean, you get some back. We could have Social Security credit for the first 7 years or 5 to 7 years of caring for a child at home. But to do that, we have to give value to women and to this, quote, women's work. So I am saying to you, we have a lot of symptoms. And we certainly have to work on the symptoms. I mean, of course you're going to work on the symptoms. But if we don't work on the basis, on the devaluation of women and the stereotypically feminine, you don't have the basis, do you? And men don't have the basis. And, but we can do it. And we are doing it. And I'm counting on you to do it. And I'd love to hear the last one if we have time.
Well, it's both a question and a suggestion.
Great.
My suggestion is, well, first of all, I want to thank you. This is unbelievably mind-blowing. I felt like I've been out there on my own for a while with some of these thoughts, and when I saw this, I went, OMG. Thank you so much. And my suggestion is, after this, let's not let this die. We've got people in this room, women and men. Can we keep the dialogue going, maybe form a group, something, to support one another in moving forward?
Wonderful, brava.
Yeah.
What is your name?
Deanna Douglas.
Dina?
Deanna.
Deanna.
And
can you all see Deanna? Go up to her after this. Sign
OMG.
OMG. But listen, I also want to tell you that part of our Caring Economy campaign are online caring economy leadership training programs. And that may be a terrific tool for the group of women and men, I hope. As I said, we have to work with enlightened men.
Absolutely.
It's in their best interests. I mean, it's that simple. But even if it weren't, they should. But that's another story. I tell you, I happen to be married to a very caring man. So I'm very careful always to make sure that people understand that we're not talking about anything inherent in women or men. Some women can be uncaring, I mean, as we have been discussing. So find Diana. Sign up. Do you have a piece of paper where people can sign up? Or give her your cards and do it. And let us know. Let Kimberly Otis, our wonderful director. Kim, could you stand up, please, my dear? This is Kimberly Otis. As you heard in passing, she is the co-founder of the Caring Economy campaign. She lives right here in Washington, D.C. So we can even consider maybe doing a special cohort, because we have, of the Caring Economy online leadership program for people like you who are in the State Department, which would be fun. So do it, Diana. What a wonderful way to close. I'm so glad I insisted that you be heard. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're wonderful. You're wonderful. Thank you. Oh, my pleasure. Let me go and give you back your podium. Oh, you want me to stay here? All right, I'll stay here. Have no problem staying here.
I just wanted you to stay nearby because we have some party favors for you.
Oh, hi. Well, thank you. I get some presents. Always like presents.
Dr. Eisler, on behalf of Executive Women at State, we'd like to present you with this thank you. I think your presentation is an inspiration for all of us. It's up to us to change the discourse and the strategy, and I think we will go forth and do just that. So thank you very much.
So much. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you.
Thank you, my dear.
Thank you.
So do I stay here or get
Yes,
to
you
leave?
stay here.
I stay here? All right, as you can see, I can be very accommodating here.
My name is John Robinson. I'm the Director of the Office of Civil Rights and Chief Diversity Officer, and I feel privileged to have the opportunity to make closing remarks. Well, I'd like to summarize our lesson for the day, our word for the day, is caring economy. So let's take that and make it a new working word. Another word for today is prodigious. I asked Dr. Eisler what was the first job she ever did for money. And she said she was in high school, she worked in retail shoe sales. I would say that the distance that you have traveled since those humble beginnings is absolutely prodigious. In addition to a prodigious message, I would like to thank again Executive Women at State, who are a model for the rest of government of how generations of women can be mutually supportive. And also to the Office of Civil Rights, my office, and what a terrific job Verena, Tubi, Jessica have done to make this program possible. Prodigious. There we find it again. Some of the messages: balancing work and family and those commitments. And I'd also like to recognize Marcia Bernacat from the DG's office, ADAS, who's come to join us today. And with that, I have the opportunity to say, go and serve. Go and serve, yes. You're in it to learn, now go and serve. Again, thank you very much.